Well, welcome to this podcast. This is called Edward, Sarah, James and Blossom, and it's the history of the development of immunisation. Now, of course, anyone is immunised against a transmissible disease as a result of suffering from the act of infection. So when someone becomes infected with the disease, the antigen causing the disease, that is whatever it is the body recognises as foreign, could be a virus, could be a bacteria, it's the pathogenic etiological organism, that gets into the body and it acts as an antigen. Once an antigen is in the body, it stimulates the immune system to develop antibodies. Antibodies are the immunoglobulins that actually fight the infection in a specific way. That's why antigens are called antigens. They're antibody-generating molecules. So in this sense, immunisation is as old as humanity. But the problem is, of course, some infections can kill the sufferer, such as lobar pneumonia in a young adult. Or other infections can leave the patient with permanent tissue or organ damage. Myocardial viral Coxsackie infection springs to mind, which can cause myocarditis and terminal heart failure even in young people. Meningococcal sepsis, for example, can damage the brain and result in amputation of limbs as a result of the meningococcal sepsis. And other infections can be passed on to those around an infected person, leading to a localised or widespread outbreak. An infection also makes people feel unwell. It's very unpleasant to have an infection, and it can result in days or weeks off work. So it would be good if there was a way of preventing the development of infections, of preventing the development of transmissible disease. That would be good. Now, one way, of course, would be to avoid the etiological causative organisms, the antigens which actually cause the disease. But the problem there is that we live in a milieu of organisms, an ocean, a seething mass of organisms. The surface of our planet is covered in potentially infecting agents. So we can't avoid them altogether. Contact is absolutely inevitable. So what to do? Well, today we can immunise against a range of infections by vaccination, providing immunity without having to suffer from the disease first. So, how did this desirable state of affairs come about? Well, as we've said, this is the story of Edward, Sarah, James and Blossom. Now, Edward Jenner was an English doctor and scientist, and is from Berkeley in Gloucestershire. And indeed his house is still there in Berkeley today. And he was the pioneer of the smallpox vaccine, and is rightly described as being the father of immuniology. And it's said about Jenner that his work saved more lives than any other man. Now, Jenner was actually born on the 17th of May 1749. And Edward Jenner actually did his medical training in Gloucestershire. But after his initial training in Gloucestershire, he went to study surgery and anatomy in London. And at the time, the greatest surgeon and anatomy teacher was John Hunter. And Jenner was lucky enough to be able to study under John Hunter at St George's Hospital in London. Now, Hunter did teach Jenner a lot about anatomy and surgery, but it wasn't that was the main influence of Hunter on Edward Jenner, because John Hunter actually gave Edward Jenner advice that came down from William Harvey. Now, William Harvey had been physician to James I, and it was William Harvey that discovered the circulation of the blood. And his advice was, don't think, try. Don't try and work it out. You're not clever enough to work it all out in your head. Just try things empirically. And this reflects Enlightenment thinking and empirical, experimental science. Doesn't matter how good your theory is, doesn't matter how clever your pathophysiology is, you can't work it out because the human body is just too complicated. You have to use empirical, evidence-based, research-based information. And it's the same today. This is one of the main bases of our evidence-based practice. It's based on this idea that comes all the way down through these generations of English scientists: don't think, try. Although I believe John Hunter was actually born in Scotland. Anyway, after a period of time in London, Edward Jenner went back to Berkeley to become a country physician. That's what he wanted to be, like a GP. Now, at this time, smallpox was a globally endemic disease, and it was a particularly horrible disease. It affected people in England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Europe, all over the world. And in England at the time, roughly consistent with other countries, was about a third of people would catch smallpox in their lifetime. And of that third of people that caught smallpox, about 1 in 4, about 25% of people who got the infection would die. This meant that globally about 1 in 11 to 1 in 12 people were dying of smallpox. And it was a really horrible disease. You would get these horrible pustules all over the body, completely scarring the face. And when the tissue necrosed, it would stink. It was a horrible, smelly, pustular disease. And as the disease process damaged the nerve endings in the dermis, it would be very painful. And for the ones that did recover, about a third were left with really bad scarring. The scarring was so bad that it was said that family members often could not recognise their affected loved ones. A person might not be able to work, they may not be able to attract a husband or attract a wife. And it was just a horrible, wretched disease. Some went blind as a result of the effect of the smallpox virus on the cornea. So there was this really horrible, rampant disease abroad at the time. But there were things that people were doing about it to try and prevent smallpox, even at this time, early in Edward Jenner's life, in his career. Now, in 1721, Lady Mary Montagu had imported the idea of a variolation into Britain after having seen it in Istanbul, where her husband was the British ambassador. So variolation was going on at this time, early in the career of Edward Jenner. Now, what is this variolation process? Well, variola is the virus that causes smallpox. So variolation means to give some smallpox. We now know that smallpox is a double-stranded DNA deoxyribonucleic acid based virus. And we now know that this is the antigen, this is the virus that causes the smallpox disease. And what they used to do was they used to take some infected material, make a cut in someone's arm and rub some of this infected smallpox material in. Now, hopefully, they took the smallpox pus or scab material from someone who had a less severe case of smallpox, sometimes called variola minor. But that didn't always work. Sometimes the people who were variolated actually got really sick. And typically, the variolation would take place into a scratch between the thumb and forefinger. Now, the idea was this would be done often to children who were in good health, who would have good resistance so they could fight off the infection. It was introduced through the skin rather than through the lungs, so there was a relatively small focus of infection, a small amount of inoculum, a single point of initial infection. And the idea here was that the immune system could recognise the small area of infection before it had time to spread. And in fact, most people would recover from this variolation process, but there was a degree of mortality associated with it. The result was that the patient did get a degree of smallpox, but the hope was it would be a milder case of smallpox, producing less facial scarring and a much lower mortality. the smaller localized infection was adequate to stimulate the immune system to produce specific immunity to the virus. So the patient would be stimulated to produce smallpox immunoglobulins, smallpox antibodies. And hopefully, as we say, not enough to kill them. It would make them sick, but hopefully they'd just be a little bit sick for a short period of time. And after that they would enjoy immunity. And Edward Jenner, as an 8-year-old boy, was in fact variolated himself. He was treated by what can only be called the quacks of the day. They purged him with laxatives, they starved him, they bled him, and then they variolated him. And he was very sick as a result of this process. And this traumatised Edward Jenner, and was probably part of the reason he was so determined to come up with a better alternative of protecting people against smallpox, as opposed to this horrible process of variolation. Now, a pox is a type of disease. It's often caused by a virus, and it's characterised by pockmarks. This is what pox means. And there's actually another type of pox. So far we've been talking about smallpox, but there was another type of pox. It's still a virus. It's a similar virus to the smallpox virus, but it's not the smallpox virus. It's the cowpox virus. And this was also around at the time. And there was a folk rumour, a common belief in the countryside, that people who had suffered from the minor disease, often just causing a bit of pustular pox formation on the hands, that people who'd suffered from this minor cowpox infection were subsequently immune to the smallpox infection. But this really hadn't been proved, and it hadn't been publicised. Now, Edward Jenner used to watch the milkmaids in his village, apparently. This is understandable. But there was one particular milkmaid called Sarah Nelms. And she actually went to see Jenner. Jenner was her doctor, and Jenner saw the pustules in Sarah's hands that Sarah had contracted from the cow she'd been milking. There was cowpox on the cow's udder, and this cow was called Blossom. So Sarah had got cowpox from Blossom. Now, if you happen to be in Tooting and you knock on the door of St George's Medical School and ask very nicely, they might let you in to see the hide of Blossom, which now hangs on the wall of St George's Medical School library, as we say in modern day Tooting. Now, Jenner wanted to demonstrate the fact that cowpox could prevent smallpox. And Edward Jenner had a gardener, and this gardener had a son who was 8 years old, the same age Jenner was when he himself had been variolated so traumatically as a child. And this 8-year-old boy on Jenner's estate was called James Phipps. And in 1796, Jenner inoculated James Phipps in both arms one day. He cut into the skin. He rubbed some of the cowpox pus from the pustules on Sarah's hands into James's arm. As a result, James Phipps developed a fever. He had some uneasiness, but he had no full-blown infection. He was just a bit unwell. And it's recorded that on the 7th day after the inoculation, he complained of uneasiness in the axilla, in his armpit, and on the 9th day he became a little chilly, lost his appetite with a bit of fever, and had a slight headache. But on the 10th day, James recovered fully. So James had been inoculated with the cowpox virus, with the cowpox antigen. Now, we now know that the cowpox virus is very similar to the smallpox virus. And if someone's infected with the cowpox virus, they will produce antibodies to the cowpox virus. But because the smallpox virus and the cowpox virus are similar, the antibodies which have been generated to the cowpox virus will also act against the smallpox virus. This is an example of what today we call cross-immunity. So because there are cowpox antibodies, they will fight the smallpox virus. This is the way it works, via cross-immunity. And inoculation means the introduction of some live material into the body. And the cowpox material would have been live. I suppose the analogy today is giving a live vaccination, because that's going to stimulate the immune system into producing antibodies. Now, a few weeks later, Edward Jenner variolated James Phipps. This would be the traditional way to stop James from getting smallpox. So really, this is what we do in modern clinical trials. We say to someone, do you want to come into our clinical trial? They can say yes or no. If they say yes, then there's a 50% chance they'll get the best treatment we've got to offer today, or a 50% chance they'll get the new treatment. So what Edward Jenner had done is he'd given James something that was really pretty safe, that is to give him cowpox, and then he used the traditional treatment of the day. He variolated James with smallpox virus, with active smallpox virus. And the great thing was that James did not develop any of the features of smallpox as someone normally would if they'd been variolated. He did not get any of the disease clinical features, nor did he pass the disease onto those he was in intimate contact with. So because James had been exposed to the cowpox, he developed antibodies to the cowpox. The antibodies to the cowpox demonstrated cross-immunity and protected James against the smallpox. So James did not have to go through the horrible, wretched time when he was 8 years old that Edward Jenner had been subjected to as an 8-year-old child himself. And yet James Phipps was now immune to this wretched disease of smallpox. And in fact, just to make sure, over the next 20 years, Edward Jenner actually reinfected James 20 times with smallpox pus, and on none of those occasions did James Phipps develop smallpox because he was immune to it. He actually worked as a gardener for Jenner for many years. He did have a bout of tuberculosis at one point, but then he recovered and did marry. He had 2 children, and he lived in a cottage provided by Jenner on the Edward Jenner estate. So, why is it that Jenner is so famous? After all, this wasn't actually a really new idea that he came up with. Variolation had been around for a while. Plenty of other people knew that cowpox could prevent against smallpox. Well, I think the reason Jenner's so famous is that he proved by subsequent challenges that James and other people he gave the cowpox virus to were immune to smallpox. It was demonstrated very conclusively by multiple potential reinfections with smallpox, but the cowpox had protected them. And another reason was that the protective cowpox pus could be effectively inoculated from person to person and not directly from cattle. So the protective cowpox could be taken from the hand of any local milkmaid and used to protect against smallpox. Jenner actually had 23 additional subjects, so he had a reasonable number of subjects. We would call that the N value today. His N was 24. There was 23 subjects and James. And it's interesting to note that Jenner also included his 11-month-old son in the process. So his belief in immunisation, in this vaccination using cowpox to prevent smallpox, was strong enough that he carried it out on his own child. Now, these ideas weren't readily accepted. In 1802, for example, there's that famous cartoon of cows jumping out of people's arms. But as time went on, it became more accepted in the early 1800s. Actually, overseas, for example, it was very rapidly accepted. In France, for example, in Napoleon's France at the time, it was accepted just within a year or two, providing massive benefit to the French population. By 1801, 100,000 people in England had actually been vaccinated. So by that kind of time, it was starting to get more popular. And in 1840, the British government banned variolation, the use of active smallpox, and provided vaccination using cowpox free of charge, meaning that the disease was virtually eradicated from England, which is quite a major advance, really, if you think about it, because before about a third of the population contracted it, and about a quarter of those died of it. So Jenner actually worked out that smallpox is more dangerous than variolation, and cowpox is less dangerous than variolation. He did the experiments for this, he had good numbers, and he publicised it. That's why Jenner's famous. Good scientific technique, followed by a good ability to communicate that to the world at large. His hypothesis was that infection with cowpox gives immunity to smallpox, and he proved this hypothesis empirically and experimentally, meaning that immunity to smallpox could be induced in a much safer way than via variolation. Now, the legacy of Edward Jenner is fairly well known. He was the precursor of the work on immunity against other infectious diseases. For example, Louis Pasteur developed vaccines against anthrax and rabies, and Robert Koch developed vaccination against tuberculosis. Albeit 3/4 of a century later, it was based on this pioneering work by Edward Jenner. But what about this horrible disease of smallpox? Well, in 1979, the World Health Organization declared that smallpox had been eradicated. It was largely the result of coordinated public health efforts by many people, of course, but vaccination was an essential component. And it's actually interesting, although the disease has been eradicated, some pus samples are still kept in laboratories. For example, the Centre for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, has got some live smallpox virus, and the State Research Centre for Virology and Biotechnology in the Soviet Union has still got some as well. But hopefully humankind will never be foolish or cruel enough to let this virus out of the laboratory. What happened to Jenner himself? Well, on the 25th of January 1823, unfortunately, Jenner was discovered in a state of apoplexy. Now, apoplexy is an old-fashioned word. It could really mean anything. But from the description of Edward Jenner's attendants, his right side had been paralysed, so it seems fairly clear that he'd taken a stroke. And he didn't really recover from this, and he seemed to have another stroke, a second stroke, the day after, on the 26th of January. And on that day, the 26th of January, 1823, at the age of 73, Edward Jenner himself died. Jenner was buried locally, and there was a man attended his funeral, a man who was in reasonably good health. He had a wife, he had 2 children, and he went to Jenner's funeral to mourn. The name of that mourner was James Phipps.